Have you ever stared into your own reflection and felt something off? Like the image staring back wasn't just you, but something darker, something watching? Now imagine that feeling, amplified by the silence of a remote forest and the cold shimmer of a lake so still it feels alive. Welcome to Labyrinth of the Mind. Today, we're diving into the chilling mystery of the lake of the deadly reflection. Before we begin, subscribe and hit the notification bell. What you're about to hear is no ordinary story. It's one that might make you question your own reality. Helena Marquez, a seasoned investigative journalist, had spent years chasing the inexplicable. Haunted houses, cryptic disappearances, strange phenomena. Yet nothing prepared her for the whispers she heard about a lake hidden deep in the cold waters forest. The locals avoided the area entirely, speaking in hushed tones about people who had gone mad after looking into its waters. Most dismissed it as superstition, but Helena knew better. Where there was fear, there was often truth. Driven by a mix of skepticism and curiosity, she packed her gear and set out alone to uncover the secrets of the lake. The journey to the lake was grueling. The path twisted and turned through dense, ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing at the overcast sky. The deeper Helena ventured, the more the air changed, dense and suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing down on her. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive sound of her own breathing and the crunch of dried twigs beneath her boots. As she reached the edge of the forest, the lake revealed itself. It was smaller than she expected, encircled by jagged rocks and a thin layer of mist hovering just above its surface. The water was impossibly still, like glass, reflecting the sky, the trees, and Helena herself in haunting clarity. The sight was breathtaking yet deeply unsettling. It felt as though the lake was not simply reflecting the world around it, but observing, studying, and waiting. Helena set up her equipment, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. She recorded her initial observations, her voice steady but her heart pounding. I've arrived at what locals call the lake of the deadly reflection. There's an unnatural stillness here, no wind, no wildlife, not even the sound of water lapping against the shore. The reflection is unnervingly clear, almost alive. As she moved closer to the water's edge, the unease transformed into outright fear. The reflection seemed wrong. Not in an obvious way. Her face was there, her posture, her clothes. But something subtle and deeply disquieting was off. Her reflection didn't blink in unison with her. Its gaze felt too focused, too knowing, as if it was staring not at her but into her. She took a step back, her breathing shallow, and the reflection did the same, but with a delay, like it was deciding whether to follow. Helena's journalist instinct screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity held her in place. She crouched at the water's edge, her fingers trembling as she touched its surface. It was colder than ice, and for a split second, she swore she felt something move beneath her fingertips, as though the lake had shuddered at her touch. She recoiled, wiping her hand on her jacket, her heart racing. Suddenly, a low, almost imperceptible hum filled the air. It wasn't coming from the lake or the forest. It was inside her head, vibrating in her skull. She stumbled backward, clutching her ears, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. As she looked back at the water, her reflection was no longer mirroring her movements. Instead, it stood still, watching her with an expression of cruel amusement that didn't belong to her face. In that moment, Helena knew this was no ordinary lake. It wasn't just reflecting her image. It was pulling something from her, something buried and dark. Her instinct screamed again, leave now. But as she turned to run, the hum stopped abruptly, and the forest around her seemed to close in, the trees forming a wall of shadows. She was trapped, with the lake silently beckoning her back. Don't look away, a voice whispered, not from the forest, not from the lake, but from deep inside her mind. And for the first time in her career, Helena felt true, paralyzing terror. Helena awoke the next morning, her makeshift camp eerily undisturbed despite the oppressive atmosphere of the previous night. The lake stretched before her, calm and unassuming, as though mocking her with its stillness. Determined to document the phenomenon, she reviewed the footage from her camera, hoping it would reveal some clue about the bizarre reflections she'd witnessed. But the screen showed nothing unusual, just her face, the trees, and the still waters. Frustrated yet undeterred, she decided to spend more time observing the lake. As the day wore on, Helena found herself inexplicably drawn to the water's edge. It was as if an invisible thread was pulling her closer, commanding her attention. The sunlight glinted off the surface, creating patterns that seemed to move in ways they shouldn't, as though the lake was alive and shifting beneath its glassy exterior. Every time she tried to look away, her eyes were dragged back to the water, and with each glance, the unease in her chest grew heavier, more suffocating. When she leaned over the edge again, something was different. The reflection stared back at her, but the details were off. Her eyes, though identical in shape and color, felt sharper, colder, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Her reflection's expression held a subtle malice that made her stomach churn. Helena blinked and leaned closer, her fingers brushing the ground for balance. That's when she saw it. Her reflection smiled. Not a normal smile. This was twisted, cruel, and completely out of sync with her own expression. She froze, unable to breathe, her pulse hammering in her ears. Suddenly, the smile vanished, and the reflection resumed mirroring her movements perfectly. Helena stumbled back, her heart pounding. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in her perception. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Something was watching her. The forest around the lake seemed to grow darker as the hours passed, the shadows lengthening unnaturally despite the early afternoon sun. The air became heavier, colder, carrying an unsettling silence that pressed against her ears. She decided to explore the perimeter of the lake, searching for anything that could explain the strange occurrences. As she walked, she noticed carvings on the rocks near the shore, ancient symbols etched deep into the stone, their meanings long lost to time. They were jagged and chaotic, as if they had been carved in desperation or fear. She ran her fingers over them, feeling an unnatural chill radiating from the stone. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, and she heard it, a whisper. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Helena. Her blood turned to ice. She spun around, scanning the forest, but saw no one. Her mind raced. How could anyone know her name? She clutched her camera tightly, her fingers trembling as the whisper came again, this time louder and more insistent. Helena, look. Against her better judgment, she turned back toward the lake. The water rippled despite the absence of wind, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing just beneath the surface. It was her, but not her. The reflection moved with a strange fluidity, almost gliding across the water, its gaze locked onto her. The figure raised a hand, and to Helena's horror, its palm pressed against the inside of the water's surface, as if trying to break through. Helena staggered backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices calling her name, begging her to return to the lake. Some voices were familiar, echoing memories from her childhood, old arguments, lost loved ones. But there were others, voices she didn't recognize, cold and hollow, dripping with malice. Desperate to escape, she ran back to her camp, her legs trembling beneath her. The forest seemed alive now, the trees groaning and creaking as if moving in time with her frantic heartbeat. When she finally reached her tent, she collapsed onto the ground, clutching her chest, trying to calm the rising panic. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more persistent, as if the lake itself was calling her back. Her reflection wasn't just a reflection. It was something else entirely, something that wanted her, that needed her. And as night began to fall, Helena realized she wasn't just an observer anymore. She was a part of the lake's story. Night had fallen, and the forest around the lake had transformed into a realm of shadows and silence. Helena sat in her tent, the flimsy fabric doing little to shield her from the oppressive darkness pressing in on all sides. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that was somehow worse. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves outside made her flinch. She tried to focus on the footage she had captured earlier, hoping to make sense of the bizarre events, but her laptop screen flickered ominously as if something unseen was interfering. As she replayed the recordings, her heart sank. There it was, the moment she had looked into the lake. But the video wasn't what she remembered. The reflection in the footage didn't mimic her movements. It stared directly into the camera, its eyes unblinking, lips curling into a menacing smirk that Helena hadn't made. The reflection's hands moved, rising slowly, as if beckoning her closer. A chill ran down her spine as she paused the video. The reflection's hand was pressed against the screen, its palm seeming to reach for her. Shutting the laptop in panic, Helena sat frozen, her mind racing. She couldn't explain what she had just seen, but one thing was certain. The lake was no ordinary body of water. Something lived within it, something far beyond her understanding. Determined to document the truth, she grabbed her flashlight and camera, steeling herself to face the lake again. The forest seemed to close in as she made her way back, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. The air was thick and cold, making it hard to breathe. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, shifting and twisting as though mocking her. When she finally reached the lake, it looked even more sinister under the pale light of the moon. The surface was unnaturally smooth, reflecting the night sky with such clarity it felt like a portal to another world. Helena set up her camera, every nerve in her body screaming for her to leave. But she couldn't. Something compelled her to stay, an invisible force pulling her closer to the water's edge. As she peered into the lake, her reflection stared back, but this time it wasn't alone. Behind her mirrored image, shadowy figures emerged, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They stood motionless, their hollow eyes locked onto her. She spun around, expecting to see someone behind her, but the forest was empty. Turning back to the lake, the figures in the reflection had moved closer. They surrounded her mirrored self, their mouths opening in silent screams. The water began to ripple, the figures' distorted shapes shifting and melting, as though the lake itself was consuming them. Helena stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. Her flashlight rolled away, its beam flickering wildly as it illuminated the forest around her. That's when she noticed them, bare footprints in the damp soil, leading from the lake to where she sat. They were fresh, the edges still glistening with water, but no one else was there. A low hum began to rise from the lake, growing louder and more resonant, vibrating in her chest like a second heartbeat. She scrambled to her feet, her camera still recording, and pointed it toward the water. The reflection was gone. Instead, the lake showed something else entirely, a vision of herself, but different. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and lifeless. The vision spoke without moving its lips, its voice echoing in Helena's mind. "Come closer, Helena. See the truth. See what lies beneath." Helena's legs moved on their own, dragging her toward the water. She fought against the pull, her mind screaming to stop, but her body refused to obey. Her feet reached the edge, her reflection now a perfect mimic again, but its smile was grotesque, stretched far beyond what was humanly possible. The lake began to shimmer, the surface breaking apart into waves that reached for her like grasping hands. In a last desperate effort, Helena tore herself away, stumbling back into the forest. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence that was almost deafening. Her camera fell to the ground, the lens pointing toward the lake as the recording light blinked red. She dared to look back one last time. The lake had returned to its still, glassy state, but her reflection was no longer there. Instead, the surface was empty, a void that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Helena turned and ran, her breaths ragged, the forest closing in tighter with every step. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was watching her, its silent call echoing in her mind. Something had changed. She could feel it in her bones. The lake hadn't just shown her something terrifying, it had taken something from her, and she wasn't sure she'd ever get it back. Helena sat in the safety, or illusion of safety, of her tent, her mind racing with the events she had witnessed. The lake wasn't just an anomaly of nature, it was alive, a malevolent force that had shown her a side of herself she couldn't bear to acknowledge. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that distorted smile, those hollow figures, and the beckoning waters. But exhaustion eventually won, and she drifted into a restless slumber. Her dreams were vivid and suffocating. She was back at the lake, its surface rippling unnaturally despite the absence of wind. Her reflection stood across from her, but it wasn't her. Its eyes burned with malice, its face contorted into a grotesque, twisted version of her own. The reflection spoke, its voice overlapping with whispers that echoed in her ears. "Do you know what you truly are, Helena? Do you dare to look deeper?" Suddenly, the reflection reached out, its hand breaking through the surface of the water. Helena tried to back away, but her feet were rooted to the ground, paralyzed by some invisible force. The hand grabbed her wrist, its icy grip burning into her skin, and pulled her forward. The forest around her dissolved, replaced by an infinite expanse of darkness. Helena gasped awake, her heart pounding as if she'd run a marathon. But the nightmare hadn't ended. Her wrists still throbbed with a cold, searing pain. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it on her arm, only to find a faint, dark handprint burned into her skin. It wasn't just a dream. Something had touched her, something from the lake. Desperate for answers, Helena grabbed her camera and stormed out of the tent, determined to confront the lake one last time. The forest seemed even more oppressive than before, the trees twisting unnaturally as if leaning toward her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her footsteps and the pounding of her heart. When she reached the lake, it was no longer still. The surface churned violently, reflecting not the serene moonlit sky, but a chaotic storm of shadows. Figures moved beneath the surface, indistinct but unmistakably human. They clawed and thrashed as if trying to escape, their hollow eyes and twisted faces filled with eternal despair. Helena stepped closer, her camera rolling, determined to document every horrifying detail. But as she neared the edge, the churning water stilled, and the lake returned to its glass-like calm. Her reflection appeared again, but this time it wasn't alone. The shadowy figures stood behind it, their forms more defined now, their faces grotesque amalgamations of pain and fury. The reflection grinned at her, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. Then, without warning, it spoke. "You can't run from yourself, Helena. The lake shows all. The truth. The lies. The darkness." Helena's legs buckled beneath her as the water began to ripple outward from the reflection. It was as if the lake itself was coming alive, the ripples forming a rhythmic pulse that matched her own racing heartbeat. The whispering voices returned, louder now, overlapping in a deafening cacophony that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Suddenly, the reflection stepped out of the water. It wasn't a mere image anymore. It was flesh and blood, a perfect replica of Helena, but with eyes that burned like embers. The doppelganger moved toward her, its steps deliberate and predatory. Helena scrambled backward, her mind racing. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. But the cold, damp ground beneath her palms and the searing intensity of the figure's gaze told her otherwise. The doppelganger knelt down beside her, its voice low and venomous. "You've lived a life of lies, burying the truth, hiding from what you are. But you can't hide from me." Before Helena could react, the doppelganger grabbed her face, forcing her to look into its eyes. In that instant, she was no longer in the forest. She was submerged in the lake, surrounded by darkness and shadowy figures that clawed at her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her lungs burned as she struggled to surface, but the weight of the water, and the memories it revealed, was unbearable. The lake wasn't just showing her reflections, it was pulling her into a place where every suppressed fear, every hidden truth, and every dark impulse came to life. She saw flashes of her past, moments she had buried, faces she had forgotten, choices she regretted. Each memory twisted into something monstrous, haunting her as she sank further. Just as she felt herself slipping into oblivion, Helena's vision blurred, and she found herself back on the shore, gasping for air. The doppelganger was gone, and the lake was still once more. But something had changed. She felt it in her bones, in the way the forest seemed to watch her, in the lingering whispers that echoed faintly in her mind. The handprint on her wrist had darkened, the outline sharper now, as if marking her. And when she glanced at her reflection in the lake, it was no longer just her. The shadowy figures still loomed, their hollow eyes filled with a silent promise. This wasn't over. Helena staggered back toward her tent, her mind reeling. She had uncovered the truth about the lake, but it had come at a price. Something had followed her back, something that would never let her go. The morning after her harrowing confrontation with the lake, Helena awoke drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though she'd been running for hours. The tent felt stifling, the air heavy and suffused with an almost metallic tang. Her wrists still ached where the phantom handprint lingered, its dark edges now faintly pulsing, as if alive. She sat up slowly, every nerve in her body tingling with unease, and reached for her camera, hoping the footage would provide clarity, or, at the very least, proof that she wasn't losing her mind. Reviewing the footage, Helena's hands trembled. The recordings captured far more than she had anticipated. The doppelganger stepping out of the lake, the shadowy figures beneath the surface, and the reflection's malevolent smile were all there, vivid and undeniable. But as she watched, something else caught her eye. In the background of the video, hidden among the forest trees, were faint shapes, human silhouettes, barely discernible yet unmistakably present. They stood motionless, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Helena paused the video, her breath catching in her throat. The figures hadn't been there the night before. At least, not that she had noticed. Could they have been watching her all along, unseen but always present? A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized the implications. She wasn't just being haunted by the lake. The entire forest seemed alive, conspiring to trap her. Determined to find answers, Helena decided to explore the carvings she had seen the day before. The strange symbols etched into the rocks now seemed less like random markings and more like warnings. She photographed each one, her fingers tracing the jagged lines as if trying to decipher their meaning. The cold radiating from the stones was almost unbearable, biting into her skin despite the warm morning sun. As she worked, a voice broke the silence. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakably human. "Helena," she froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice came again, closer this time. "Helena, come back to us." She spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind her, but the forest was empty. The voice wasn't coming from the trees, it was emanating from the lake. The surface shimmered unnaturally, rippling even though there was no wind. The whisper grew louder, joined by others, overlapping in a chorus of desperate pleas. Each voice sounded eerily familiar, as though belonging to people she had known in her life, some alive, some long dead. Helena clutched her head, the cacophony overwhelming her. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty forest. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the ground beneath her feet. The lake shimmered again, and images began to form on its surface, like a mirror reflecting scenes from another world. Helena saw herself as a child, standing at the edge of a different body of water, her mother pulling her back. She had no memory of the event, yet the scene felt achingly familiar. The image shifted, showing an older version of herself in a dimly lit room, staring at a cracked mirror. A shadow loomed behind her, its face obscured but its presence suffocating. As the images faded, the whispers returned, this time with a single chilling phrase. "You've been here before." Helena staggered backward, her mind reeling. She hadn't grown up anywhere near this forest. She had no connection to the lake, or so she thought. But the lake was telling a different story, one that suggested her life had always been intertwined with this place. Desperate for answers, she pulled out her laptop and began researching the area, combing through old records, local legends, anything that could provide a clue. What she found left her cold. Decades ago, there had been reports of disappearances in the region, all centered around the lake. The victims were said to have been drawn to the water, lured by visions and voices only they could see and hear. Some had left behind journals, their final entries filled with cryptic warnings. "Don't look too long, and the water shows the truth." One journal, however, stood out. It belonged to a man named Elias Marquez. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the name. Her grandfather, long estranged from her family and thought to have disappeared years ago. The journal described his encounters with the lake, eerily similar to her own. He had written about the whispers, the figures in the water, and the overwhelming compulsion to return, even as he felt his sanity slipping away. The final entry sent chills down her spine. "I saw her. My granddaughter. She was there, in the water. She looked at me and smiled, but it wasn't her. It was something else, wearing her face. The lake knows her. It's been waiting for her." Helena slammed the laptop shut, her breathing ragged. The lake had been calling her long before she ever knew it existed. Her connection to it wasn't a coincidence. It was destiny, a dark thread woven through her family's history. And now, it was her turn to face whatever truth lay hidden beneath its depths. As she stared at the shimmering water, she realized the lake wasn't just a reflection of her fears. It was a reflection of her past, her bloodline, her very soul. And it wanted something from her. Something she wasn't sure she could give. Helena sat frozen at the edge of the lake, her grandfather's words echoing in her mind. The lake knows her. It's been waiting for her. The revelation struck her like a cold wave, leaving her breathless and disoriented. She wasn't here by accident. She was drawn, just like the others who had vanished. The realization gnawed at her resolve, but she knew she couldn't leave, not yet. Not without answers. The forest seemed to sense her hesitation. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the faint hum she had heard before returned, vibrating through the ground beneath her. Clutching her camera and journal, Helena forced herself to stand. If the lake wanted her, she would confront it on her own terms. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, its unseen eyes tracking her every move. Determined to uncover the truth, Helena ventured deeper into the surrounding woods, hoping to find clues about the lake's origins. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers overhead. The deeper she went, the stranger the forest became. Carvings similar to the ones she had seen by the lake covered the bark of the trees, forming patterns that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. As she moved through the suffocating silence, a faint sound reached her ears, the crunch of footsteps. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of the footsteps growing louder, closer. Helena gripped her flashlight, spinning around to illuminate the path behind her. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty woods. And yet, the sound persisted. It wasn't just one set of footsteps, it was many surrounding her, coming from all directions. Panic set in as she realized she was no longer alone. Her breathing quickened as shadows began to move at the edges of her vision. They weren't natural, too fast, too fluid, their forms bending and twisting in impossible ways. Helena stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering wildly as if the batteries were being drained by an unseen force. She tripped over a root and fell hard onto the forest floor, her flashlight clattering out of reach. Before she could scramble to her feet, a figure stepped into the faint light. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. His face was eerily familiar, his features sharp and angular, just like the photograph she had seen in her grandfather's journal. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. It didn't speak but raised a hand, pointing toward the lake. Helena's chest tightened as the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in a deafening chorus that seemed to emanate from the very ground. "Come back. Come see. Come home." Unable to resist the pull, Helena rose to her feet and followed the figure, her legs moving as if on autopilot. It led her back to the lake, the air growing colder with every step. The water was no longer calm. It churned violently, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The figure stopped at the edge of the lake, turning to face her. Its hollow eyes bore into hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, a trace of humanity. "Why me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The figure's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, the water began to rise, forming a column that reached toward the sky. Within the column, Helena saw faces, dozens of them, twisting and writhing in agony. Their mouths moved as if screaming, but the only sound was the relentless hum that filled the air. Helena's knees buckled as the vision overwhelmed her. The faces weren't strangers, they were the missing. The people who had disappeared around the lake. And at the center of them all was her grandfather, his face contorted in anguish, his hollow eyes staring directly at her. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single voice that seemed to come from the lake itself. "You belong to us, Helena. You always have." The water surged forward, icy tendrils wrapping around her ankles and pulling her toward the edge. She fought against it, her screams swallowed by the deafening roar of the lake. As the water climbed higher, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in its surface. It was no longer her. The face staring back at her was twisted, malevolent, its eyes burning with a hatred she didn't recognize. Desperation clawed at her chest as she realized the truth. The lake didn't just show reflections, it absorbed them, twisting them into something darker, something that it could control. And now it wanted her. Helena's strength faltered as the water pulled her closer. She dug her fingers into the dirt, her nails breaking as she fought to stay on solid ground. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her arm, yanking her back. She turned to see another figure, this one older, frail but determined. It was the man from the carvings, Elias. "You have to fight it," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the roar of the lake. "It feeds on fear. Don't let it take you." Helena locked eyes with him, a surge of resolve flooding her veins. She planted her feet firmly in the ground and screamed into the darkness, her voice cutting through the chaos. The water recoiled slightly, its grip loosening. She scrambled back, gasping for air as the lake's surface calmed once more. When she looked up, Elias was gone. Only the faint echo of his voice remained, a warning whispered on the wind. "It's not over." Helena collapsed onto the shore, her body trembling. She had survived, but the lake had left its mark on her, both physically and mentally. And as she stared into its glassy surface, she knew the battle was far from over. Helena sat on the edge of the lake, her breath shallow and labored. The chill of the forest gnawed at her, but it was nothing compared to the cold terror coursing through her veins. The water was still now, eerily calm, as if mocking her defiance. She could feel it watching her, waiting for her next move. The whispers had quieted, but their absence was almost worse, a suffocating silence that seemed to press down on her, amplifying every heartbeat, every trembling breath. She knew she couldn't leave. The lake wouldn't let her. Something tied her to this place, something ancient and sinister that she had yet to understand. Gathering the last remnants of her courage, Helena grabbed her flashlight and journal, determined to uncover the truth once and for all. As she approached the water's edge, the stillness shattered. The lake began to ripple, its surface distorting the moonlight into a chaotic dance of shadows. Helena stopped, her flashlight flickering as if the batteries were failing again. She felt the hum returning, low and deep, vibrating through her chest and into her skull. This time, however, it wasn't alone. A voice rose from the depths of the lake, soft at first but growing louder with every word. "Helena, come closer. It's time." The voice was her own, but twisted, layered with an undertone of malice that sent shivers down her spine. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The pull was stronger now, an invisible force dragging her toward the water. The surface began to shift, and her reflection appeared once more. But it wasn't the same. Its face was gaunt, its eyes sunken and hollow, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The reflection grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Helena's stomach churned as she realized this wasn't just her reflection. It was something else entirely, something using her face to lure her in. "You've hidden from the truth long enough," the reflection hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "The lake doesn't lie. It shows what you are, and what you've always been." Suddenly, the water surged upward, forming a towering column that loomed over her. Within it, shadowy figures writhed and twisted, their faces contorted in eternal agony. Helena recognized some of them from the journal, names and faces of the disappeared. But there were others, countless others, their forms flickering like phantoms caught between worlds. The reflection stepped out of the water, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. It circled her, its glowing eyes boring into hers. "You've always belonged here, Helena. This is where it ends, and where it begins." Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet gave way, and she plunged into the freezing depths of the lake. The cold was unbearable, like knives slicing through her skin, but what terrified her more was the darkness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a living, suffocating void that wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into its embrace. Shapes moved in the darkness, brushing against her, whispering in her ears. Their voices were fragmented, overlapping, each one a piece of a puzzle she couldn't solve. "Help us! Join us! See the truth!" Helena thrashed, desperate for air, but the lake wouldn't release her. Memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't her own. She saw the lives of those who had come before her, their hopes, their fears, their final moments as the lake consumed them. She saw her grandfather, Elias, standing at the water's edge, pleading with the reflection that wore her face. And then she saw herself, not as she was, but as the lake had shaped her, twisted, hollow, and consumed by darkness. "No," she screamed, bubbles escaping her lips as the cold water filled her lungs. She fought with every ounce of strength she had, clawing her way upward, desperate to escape. The shadows clawed back, their hands gripping her arms, her legs, her throat. But just as she thought she would be pulled under forever, a blinding light pierced the darkness. The lake roared in defiance, its surface erupting as Helena broke free, gasping for air. She collapsed on the shore, coughing violently, her body trembling from the cold. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. When she opened her eyes, the lake was calm again, its surface reflecting the moonlight as if nothing had happened. But Helena knew better. She could feel it inside her, the mark the lake had left, the darkness it had planted deep within her soul. Her reflection stared back at her from the water, but it was no longer hers. It was something else, watching her with a cruel smile, a silent promise that this wasn't the end. As Helena staggered to her feet, she realized the truth. The lake had shown her what she could become, but it hadn't taken her. Not yet. The battle was far from over, and the lake would be waiting for her return. And she knew deep down that one day, she would have no choice but to face it again. Helena stood at the edge of the lake, her body trembling, her breath visible in the icy air. The forest had fallen silent again, as if the entire world were holding its breath, waiting for her next move. The water before her was calm, unnervingly so, its surface reflecting the pale moonlight with unnatural clarity. But she knew better than to trust its stillness. Beneath that glassy surface lay something ancient and malevolent, watching her, waiting for her to falter. She clutched the journal tightly against her chest, its damp pages warped and smudged from her escape. Elias's words echoed in her mind. The lake knows her. It's been waiting for her. She had come searching for answers, but the truths she had uncovered felt more like a curse than a revelation. The lake had shown her things she couldn't unsee, had dragged her into a darkness she couldn't escape. As she turned to leave, her legs unsteady, she caught a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned back toward the lake. There, on the water's surface, her reflection stared back. It looked normal at first, mirroring her every move, but as she watched, it changed. The smile returned, subtle at first, then stretching unnaturally wide, splitting her face in a grotesque mockery of human expression. The reflection's eyes darkened, glowing faintly with the same hollow light she had seen in the shadowy figures beneath the water. It raised a hand, waving slowly, mockingly, before fading into the ripples. Helena staggered backward, her chest tight with fear. The lake wasn't done with her. She could feel its pull, its whispers lingering at the edges of her mind. Even as she forced herself to turn away, every step felt like a struggle against an invisible tether. The forest seemed different now, its shadows deeper, its silence more oppressive. The carvings on the trees glowed faintly in the moonlight, pulsating like veins carrying some dark lifeblood through the woods. As Helena passed, she swore she could hear faint whispers emanating from them, snatches of words, fragments of voices that called her name. Finally, she reached her camp. The tent was torn, her belongings scattered as though something, or someone, had rummaged through them. Her laptop was open, the screen cracked, but still flickering with the last frame of her video. It showed the lake, but the reflection wasn't hers. It was her doppelganger, staring directly into the camera, its mouth moving silently. She hesitated, then pressed play. The recording was distorted, the audio warped with static, but she could make out the voice beneath it, her own but not hers. "You'll come back. You always come back. The lake doesn't let go." Helena slammed the laptop shut, her breathing ragged. She packed what little she could salvage and fled, leaving the tent and her equipment behind. The forest seemed to close in around her as she stumbled through the darkness, the trees whispering her name, the faint hum of the lake following her like a second heartbeat. When she finally reached her car, she collapsed into the driver's seat, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, the headlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. But even as the forest faded into the rearview mirror, the sense of unease didn't leave her. The whispers had stopped, but their absence felt like a warning. She glanced at her wrist, the dark handprint still faintly visible, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. Hours later, she arrived back in the city, her apartment a welcome reprieve from the oppressive nightmare of the forest. She locked the door behind her, double-checking every window, every corner, as if the lake's reach could somehow extend into her sanctuary. But even surrounded by the familiar, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. In the bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face, hoping to wash away the lingering fear. When she looked up, her reflection stared back, but it didn't feel right. The face was hers, but the eyes weren't. They were hollow, glowing faintly, and they stared at her with a knowing malice. Helena stumbled backward, her heart racing. The mirror cracked down the center, the fissure splitting her reflection in two. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the vision was gone. The mirror was whole again, showing only her pale, frightened face. But she knew it wasn't over. The lake had marked her, claimed a piece of her soul, and it wouldn't stop until it had all of her. As Helena sat in the darkened room, the hum returned, soft, faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the mirror or the apartment. It was inside her, a reminder that no matter how far she ran, the lake would always be with her. The lake of the deadly reflection remains a mystery, its waters hiding secrets too dark to comprehend. But what haunts me most is the question, was it really the lake, or was it me all along? Tell me your theories in the comments below. Share this video with someone who dares to look into the unknown. And don't forget, sometimes, the scariest reflections aren't found in water, but in ourselves. Until next time, if you're brave enough to return,